Sourcing in Procurement and Supply. Unit 6. International and e-sourcing content. In the business environment, most organizations trade globally to be internationally recognized as well as enjoying some economies of scale. Technology has therefore helped to trade internationally without always meeting physically until the need be. In this section, we will look at issues with respect to international sourcing as well as e-sourcing. The first section in this unit is going to help us understand the nature and meaning of international sourcing as well as the need to engage in international sourcing. We will also look at some challenges associated with international sourcing. At the end of this section, we should be able to define international sourcing, mention reasons for international sourcing, identify some challenges associated with international sourcing. Definition of international sourcing. At this point, we all know sourcing is basically that part of procurement process that is concerned with how and where services or products are obtained. That is the process of identifying, selecting, and developing suppliers for a particular requirement in the market. International sourcing then is about sourcing goods and services from overseas or other country suppliers, essentially importing. What are some of the reasons why organizations would use international sourcing or source for their requirements outside their country? 1. Because there are improvements in transport technology, that is, creating the shrinking of distance and related risk for logistics. Thanks to electronic advancements made for traveling, businesses can now be at various places at the same time. Thanks to GPS, for instance, which is connecting the world, making the world a global village. Hence, distance is no longer a barrier. We also have improvements in ICT, abolishing distance for the purpose of communication, relationship development, delivery tracking, and performance monitoring. Now you don't even need to travel. You don't need to be looking for the next flight available unless, of course, the need be. You just sit in the comfort of your office and be transacting businesses outside your home country. Progressive reductions in trade barriers has also been identified as a major reason for international sourcing. For example, through trading blocks and agreements between member countries or between countries, facilitating direct investment in the movement of goods and services and labor. Now, thanks to international sourcing efficiencies are being achieved in our procurement process. We now have the ability to select the lowest cost supplier from anywhere in the world. We don't necessarily need to rely on our local suppliers if we think the supplier outside our home country is going to give us the best value. Country or region specific supply factors. Some goods, especially raw materials and commodities, may only be available from a particular country or may be supplied more efficiently by particular countries due to specialization, such as call centers and IT services in India. Definitely, if a particular country specializes in a certain requirement, a particular country is going to give you better value for money. Then why won't you take advantage of such a country when you need their requirements or materials in your production? There is also the harmonization of technical standards, which has enabled the sourcing of standardized components or compatible services and systems. Now, I'm sure from the reasons of international sourcing, we are able to come up with some advantages as well as disadvantages to international sourcing. Let's briefly go over some of these advantages and disadvantages. So, advantages of international sourcing. 1. It leads to improved productivity and output. We said international sourcing aids in sourcing efficiencies, where organizations have the ability to select the lowest cost supplier from anywhere around the world. Some countries also have some specific supply factors, which makes them the better option than probably your local home country. This definitely will mean using such countries will lead to improved productivity and output. International sourcing also helps to create employment, leading to greater prosperity, educational development, and other standard of living benefits. Smaller developing nations particularly benefit from the wider scope of market, since their domestic economy may have represented too small a market to allow development and resulting economies of scale. There may also be improvements in human rights and labor conditions in developing economies, where foreign buyers enforce ethical and CSR policies by monitoring in their supply chains, even if this is primarily done to protect their own reputation. A perfect example would be when the particular Chinese company ceased or refused to do business with some cocoa suppliers in Ghana simply because when they paid visits to their suppliers' farms, they realized they had children on the farm. They were using child labor. In the defense of the supplier, they were saying the children are their children. And in Ghana, in Africa, usually when parents are going to their farms, the children follow. But then it's not common to the whites, it's not common to these Chinese people. So they said if this went out, if this news should go out in the market, their reputation is going to be tarnished, and then they will end up losing their customers. So they can't continue doing business with such a supplier. This is going to help improve human rights as well as labor rights conditions in these developing nations, because that day probably is going to be the last day that particular supplier is going to have children on his or her farm. Another advantage is that global consumers benefit from more products and service choices and competitive prices. Now, thanks to international markets, you're not only limited to the products produced in your own country, you're open to international markets. You can source for anything, anywhere, for as long as it's considered legal and can be imported into your country. Some challenges of international sourcing are: 1. It encourages the exploitation of labor in developing nations for lower cost production. Labor in developing countries encounter situations such as poor wages, poor conditions, and child labor. This is partly supported by more relaxed intellectual property, employment protection, and health and safety laws. So these developed countries think, okay, labor is cheap in developing countries. Why use our own people when we can actually go to a developing nation and use their cheap labor to achieve the same output, which is going to result in lower cost of production. So they exploit labor in developing nations. This also causes unemployment in developed nations because they are going to be using their own people less and then be employing more of the cheap labor gotten from the developing nations. Another challenge of international sourcing is the export pollution, deforestation, urbanization, and other environmental damage to developing nations. Cost and unemployment in developed nations, where justified expectations of pay and conditions make labor uncompetitive with cheap labor competitors. We already explained this. They squeeze small domestic suppliers out of the supply market with negative effects on competition, communities, and cultures. Thanks to international sourcing, these small markets, small businesses, for instance, you have the SMEs, they suffer because everybody is saying it's better. I'm going to get it at a cheaper cost if I go to this country. I'm going to have better efficiencies in my sourcing if I go to this country. Quality is going to be enhanced if I go to this country. This happens, small markets, small suppliers suffer, and it even forces them to leave markets, which is not sustainable. That is a challenge of international sourcing. In conclusion, we have looked at the nature of international and global sourcing. We also highlighted on some drivers for international sourcing. We then looked at some reasons or advantages of international sourcing. Later on, we also looked at some challenges of international sourcing. Thank you.